As Tropical Storm Shantal slammed into North Carolina, entire neighborhoods were swallowed by water in a matter of hours. In places like Southern Pines and Chapel Hill, streets became rivers, bridges buckled, and apartments filled with water faster than anyone could run. But this wasn't just a weather emergency. It was a human breaking point. Families didn't just lose belongings. They lost shelter, safety, and the fragile line between stability and the streets. Tropical Storm Shantal didn't just pass through North Carolina. It carved a path of chaos across its heart. In Southern Pines, over 7 inches of rain fell within hours, turning quiet streets into torrents and collapsing sections of a country club dam. What began as steady rain transformed into a violent surge, overwhelming local infrastructure. To the north, Saxapahaw and Graham were swallowed as rainfall totals pushed past 9 inches, cutting off entire communities. In Chapel Hill, the storm brought panic as apartment complexes began to flood. Camelot Village became a rescue zone overnight, with emergency crews ferrying residents to safety under rising waters. In Orange County, the situation grew dire. More than 60 people were displaced, and floodwaters reached deep into homes near Lake Michael. Meanwhile, in Durham, rainfall climbed to a staggering 14 inches, a deluge nearly equal to 2 months of precipitation delivered in less than a day. Homes vanished underwater, roads cracked apart, and cars floated aimlessly in once familiar parking lots. Even public systems couldn't keep up. At South Estes Drive, mail trucks sat trapped and disabled. Across commercial centers like Eastgate Crossing, stores were left inundated, inventory lost beneath murky floodwaters. Meteorologists called it a once-in-a-generation event. Survivors called it something worse: the moment everything changed. Before the first drop of rain from Shantal ever fell, North Carolina was already at a breaking point. In the past year alone, the state's homeless population surged by 19%, a staggering rise that left shelters overcrowded and outreach teams stretched thin. Cities like Charlotte, Raleigh, and Durham bore the brunt, where the line between survival and collapse had already blurred for thousands. Hidden homelessness, the families living out of cars, crashing on couches, bouncing between temporary beds, had become the quiet epidemic. These are the people not always counted in official data, but who live every day on the edge, one paycheck or crisis away from total displacement. When apartments flooded in Chapel Hill and evacuation orders swept through Orange County, many weren't escaping their homes. They were losing their last refuge. The grocery store parking lots they'd once parked in overnight were now underwater. The friends' couches they'd been staying on were gone. The flood didn't just ruin buildings. It erased fragile forms of shelter already stretched thin by years of systemic neglect. In Orange County, hundreds had to be evacuated overnight, some from apartment units already damaged, others from makeshift living arrangements quietly tucked into friends' spare rooms or borrowed floor space. Even before the storm, North Carolina faced a staggering shortfall of 764,448 housing units, with affordable rentals becoming an increasingly distant dream. Waitlists for public housing had already doubled in 5 years. Add in one catastrophic weather event, and the system snapped. The people hit hardest, those already living invisibly. Families cycling between couches, workers sleeping in cars, veterans in tents by riverbanks. Across Chatham County, over 100 roads were flooded or destroyed, cutting off entire towns and delaying critical services. For emergency responders, detours weren't just inconvenient, they were life-threatening. Meanwhile, local clinics and hospitals, many still understaffed from the pandemic era, were now seeing an influx of patients not just for flood injuries, but for anxiety, trauma, and untreated chronic conditions worsened by displacement. Shelters overflowed, counseling lines rang endlessly, and no one had a clear count of how many people were truly without homes because so many had never been counted to begin with. That's the invisible burden of homelessness. The federal data might say one thing, but the real crisis includes thousands who don't show up on any spreadsheet. And now, with storm damage pushing even more people out of temporary and unstable housing, local governments are spending more to manage crisis than they would to prevent it. Emergency responders worked through the night in Orange County, evacuating more than 60 residents, many from buildings that were never meant to withstand that level of water. In Mebane, a shelter was opened hastily to house those fleeing rising creeks and flooded roads. It wasn't spacious, but it was dry, and that was enough for now. Across Chatham County, as floodwaters swallowed more than 100 roads, rescue teams scrambled to reroute ambulances and reach people still stranded. Dams creaked under pressure. Hangars and small buildings in Moncure and Mebane took direct hits from wind and water, and the sky never gave a firm promise that more wasn't on the way. Why did this many people have nowhere to go when the waters came? The answer lies not in rainfall totals, but in policy choices made long before the clouds rolled in. Mental health services in North Carolina remain severely underfunded, with federal block grants averaging less than $4,000 per community for prevention and recovery programs. That's barely enough for a small group support, let alone a coordinated trauma response after a flood. Shelter capacity was already maxed out before Shantal. Affordable housing wasn't a work in progress, it was a missing link. And that's the hardest truth to face. North Carolina didn't fail to respond. It failed to prepare. And yet, amid the wreckage, something else is happening. A shift. Not loud, but steady.
In Raleigh, a new housing development called Kings Ridge is opening its doors to 148 individuals formerly living on the streets. That might sound like a small number, but it represents a projected 15% reduction in the city's total homelessness. It's not a bandage, it's a model. Across North Carolina, the Housing First approach, which prioritizes permanent shelter before requiring employment or sobriety, has shown transformative results. In some areas, it's led to a 60% reduction in chronic homelessness. Critics once called it unrealistic. Now, cities that embraced it are outperforming those that didn't. The North Carolina General Assembly recently approved $835 million to expand the state's behavioral health system. This includes funding for addiction recovery, mental health clinics, and crisis intervention teams, resources desperately needed, especially for flood survivors carrying more than just water damage inside them. But let's be clear, recovery doesn't begin and end with government budgets. In Camelot Village, neighbors who had nothing left still passed out dry socks. In Eastgate Crossing, shop owners cleared muck not just from their own storefronts, but from others nearby. Cleanup crews, volunteers, and nonprofit organizations filled the gaps no system could fully cover. The response may not have been perfect, but it revealed where the human spirit can shine brightest, between the cracks of broken systems. Still, inspiration alone isn't policy. Progress must be scaled, sustained, and protected. Because next time, and there will be a next time, the water won't wait for budget votes. Weeks from now, most of the water will be gone. The streets will reopen. But some apartments will still be empty. Some lives are still displaced. Some people are still missing from the systems that failed to see them in the first place. James was almost one of them. A restaurant manager in Raleigh, James once lived a stable life until a sudden health crisis ended his job, drained his savings, and landed him in his car. For months, he lived that way, unnoticed, uncounted. But James's story didn't end there. A local nonprofit offered him housing, mental health support, and retraining. Today, James is back in the hospitality industry. He has an apartment, a sense of control, a voice. That's the truth beneath all the data, beneath the rising floodwaters and emergency declarations. This isn't just about storms. It's about systems, and it's about choices. So we ask you now, as we close this story, but not this crisis, what will you do today to be part of the solution? Because the reality is, you don't need a rescue boat to make a difference. You can donate to organizations making a real impact. You can share this video to keep the conversation alive. You can speak up, advocating for affordable housing and expanded mental health support. You can stand with those who have been left unseen for far too long. Let's not let it pass silently. Together, we can turn the tide, not just on homelessness, but on how we respond to crisis itself.